Plain Truth, the show where we try to get into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Plain, and joining us this week is John Galt. John, are you there?
I am here. Welcome, sir. Good to have you. Good to be back with the program.
Well, thanks. Thanks for coming. And along for the ride is my friend, Disaster Cat. Disaster Cat, are you around?
Yep, I'm here, knitting needles in hand.
Good. That's required in this world we live in. So, John, why don't we get started? And how about I ask this? How did you get started? How did you become John Galt, so to speak?
It was purely by accident. I was quite happy working as director of operations and vice president for logistics at a company which was a distributor in Central Florida for construction materials when I ran into some of the builders. You know, you'd get around and you'd meet, have a drink, et cetera, after work or during sales calls. And we were talking, and they enlightened me about what was the game that was afoot in 2006. And I said, well, what is this game? And they said, we're building homes for people who can't afford them. And I said, well, when you say for people who can't afford them, are you talking about the middle class? Are you talking about government homes? He said, all of the above. And then he pointed out the speculation. He pointed out the falsehoods within the financing schemes that were developed through the banks and the Federal Reserve. And he said, at some point, this Ponzi scheme is going to collapse. Well, I started trying to warn people. And I started writing about it. And my very first effort was a little-known piece called Pottersville, where I wrote that the banks will eventually sit there and become the supreme land and property holders. And they will rent to the masses. And the masses will be subject to the whims of the bankers and how much they let you earn, how much you will pay. And they'll determine your quality of living if you allow this to continue. Well, we allowed it to continue, and right now, the bankers via their hedge funds and the hedge funds via their friends and the overseas investors are piling into American real estate, not for the purpose of investment for the sake of making our country a better place, but for taking every last living dime that we have and squeezing it out of the serfs. What I was worried about in 2007 has come true. And it created an evolution where at one point, one of my writings was picked up by Steve Quayle. He invited me on his program, and then he offered me the Friday night slot on his show. And to this day, I'm thankful for it. For almost 2 years, I hosted his program on shortwave and the internet for 2 years. And in that entire time, we watched the collapse of the American economy, the near collapse of the American dollar, the collapse of the European economy, the collapse of Europe. And we've gone full circle now where the hyper attempt at inflation has brought us back to square one where none of the debts have really been resolved. They've been pushed out into the future. The future is now. And the last solution appears to be on the horizon, which is World War.
Okay, John, but a couple things from that. One is, I mean, have we really watched collapses, or have we simply watched the big, powerful people reeling in all the assets in the countries involved, right?
Well,
I mean, Greece didn't collapse. Greece got taken over, right?
Greece collapsed. As a functioning nation, it really does not exist. People are still eating out of garbage cans. Wild packs of dogs are running through the suburbs. Try getting surgery there if you're a middle-class person. Try getting a cure for the common cold. Hell, for the first time in modern history, we have Ebola in Europe and North America now with a Canadian that passed away, even though the health authorities are trying to deny it. Why? When nations collapse, when national and nationalist organizations, when countries collapse, the EU, the United States of America, the North American Union, which is a finger quote kind of thing when you take Mexico, the United States, and Canada as a sum total, NAFTA, when these ideals fail and collapse, things start to happen that should not happen when sovereign nations are in charge of their borders, when they're in charge of their currency and in charge of their economies. When you look at what's happened to Greece, it hasn't been taken over. No one wants to enter that country. It's a hellhole. Ireland has recovered to a point. Disaster Cat can speak to this. But in all honesty, is the quality of living as good as it was a decade ago, 15 years ago? I would say no. Same for
John, what I'm asking about is more, what happens when it collapses is then you have privatization. And so Greece has to sell off the power companies, the water companies, the islands that are national parks, stuff like that, right? And most importantly, the offshore gas rights.
But, but is it
Go ahead, John.
privatization or is it a liquidation? A liquidation to other nations and their banking unions. Everyone looks at the Federal Reserve and says, well, that's like a government entity. It's separate from the United States. Everyone looks like the Bank of England. Oh, well, that's a subsidiary of the British government. In all honesty, it's the other way around. The Federal Reserve is the fourth branch of government. The Bank of England is a co-partner with the English government. The European Central Bank is the controlling interest of the European Union. This is what Russia is fighting against. They don't want to be part of it. This is what China is fighting against. They don't want to be subservient to these entities. Whenever you have this type of economic conflict for over a decade now, bubbling under the surface, and people are starving and hurting and suffering, it eventually leads to real conflict. We have gone full circle from 1929 to 1939, from 2005 to 2014. The problem is that most people in this world cannot accept the idea that the bankers who contributed to the collapse and to the circumstances which led to World War II are the very same ones that could quite well put us on the road to World War III. And the bankers are the ones seizing control and using their governments at their behest to help them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we can see that everywhere we look. I guess from that, we could get into, when we talk about the dollar today, I think it's hard to avoid the question of war and peace. As we speak, things are awfully tense in the Ukraine. But in a sense, that's really just a dollar struggle, don't you think? It's an economic struggle for control of the planet.
It's a determination for the future of the world reserve currency. What fiat currency will reign supreme? The problem for the American people is that we cannot accept that we took the same path as the British pound, the Dutch guilder, etc. We think that because we're the strongest nation militarily, that our reserve currency and the promise to fulfill the guarantees behind it will last eternally. Historically speaking, as everyone knows, every fiat currency has failed throughout history, back to Roman times, back to Babylonian times. And as we sit there in our arrogance and try to dictate, this is how you must behave to satisfy us, the American people, the American bankers, the American government, the angst and anger towards us is magnified that much more. Instead of just coexisting and trying to have diplomatic relations with other nations, we believe that our imperial designs are much more important and will guarantee world peace. That fallacy is being exposed today. And that conflict is about to become reality any minute now, literally, as we talk tonight.
Yeah, certainly it's possible that the Russians and their whatever friends and assets and so on will make some big moves. Now, you wrote a piece on your website, which is JohnGaltFLA.com.
That's correct.
You wrote a piece about a hypothetical invasion of the Ukraine done by Russia at the same time as they would take over Georgia. Could you kind of give us your thinking behind this?
It's purely strategic. From a logical point of view, Georgia has applied to join NATO. Georgia wishes to become part of the European Union also. However, Georgia is a key pathway for pipelines coming out of Azerbaijan, the Baku region, etc., in southern Russia and into the Med. The United States has an interest there, but we never really have supported the Republic of Georgia in the method that we thought we would or should as an ally. George W. Bush turned his back on them immediately when Russia invaded South Ossetia and Abkhazia in 2008.
But John, I think the Russians said, and that's when they made it official, their policy is they will use nukes in theater war.
Oh, absolutely, but that's the same policy NATO has had since day one. It's an eye for an eye. we threaten them with nukes first. And I hate to say that, but the NATO policy is that we will use tactical nuclear weapons to stop their advances into NATO territory.
Right, but what they're saying is they're going to do it in Georgia. If we,
Correct.
You know what I mean? If we, right. In other words, a non-Russian country.
Well, actually, Georgia was a former Soviet republic.
Of course.
It does not make it right. It does not make it correct. But if anyone in the United States can tell me where the capital of Tbilisi is, I would say that would be 1 out of 1,000 people if we're lucky. Probably 1 out of 100,000. In fact, to give you an idea of how disconnected the United States is from this crisis, 60% of the American public in a recent poll couldn't identify where the Ukraine was, and 24% thought it was part of Alaska. So you're telling me that we're a nation that's ready to go to war for nations that we can't even locate on a map? When the national will for fighting is gone, there's no justifiable nationalist cause to save these people. Reality dictates that the Russians are going to reestablish their sphere of influence. The reason they're going to hit Ukraine and Georgia at the same time, in my opinion, is one, to blunt the expansion of NATO, and number two, to permanently establish a blocking region for the Saudis and Middle Eastern nations to develop pipelines coming back into Europe to compete with their monopoly. What everyone forgot about with Syria was an oil war. It was set up by the nations. Both. Yeah. Natural gas and oil pipelines coming from the Arabian Peninsula through Syria, Turkey, and into Romania and Bulgaria. We blunted that because we were incompetent. Our leadership, Neville Chamberlain Obama, had no idea how to deal with the Russians, how to deal with Al-Qaeda, and how to deal with the Saudis. That trip to Saudi Arabia he took a few weeks ago was a scolding. Never in the history of the United States has a president been invited to another national leader's, world leader's capital and had a state dinner attended by minor, shall we say, secondary leaders without the leader of that country attending. The Crown Prince turned his back on President.
Yeah, that's pretty telling. But back to this piece, which I recommend the listeners check out on a question with the Ukraine and Georgia and Russian tactics or strategy. The thing that comes to my mind is, does Russia need to do this militarily, or maybe let's phrase it: does it need to do as much with the military? For example, in the Ukraine, the whole southeast of the Ukraine is in the historical Russian sphere. And so why not just use color revolutions, pay people to protest? And the Ukraine as a state is practically failing before our very eyes anyway. You know, the riot police weren't being paid in Kiev. That's one of the reasons that the coup there went so smoothly. You know, so you got a failing state, and the Russians can just give money to the Russian-speaking areas to protest, to bring the government down. In other words, do they need to use the military? Why not just use a Gene Sharp, Soros color revolution in the Russian areas? And then as far as Georgia, looking at the map, I mean, again, on your article, you give examples of how the Russians might do it. But I mean, just for example, to me, looking at it, from South Ossetia, which is now a Russian military, base, down to Armenia, which would cut Georgia in half. That area there, the Armenians are a majority population, and they're unhappy, and most of them don't speak Georgian. And Armenia is now becoming Russian territory, right? Missiles and so on and so forth. They could start demonstrations with the Armenians there and then come in to rescue them. And in the process, that would cut Georgia in half. And they wouldn't, you know what I mean? They could. What I'm trying to say is, couldn't they do this without quite as much of a military pressure? I mean, they would still be using it, but I mean, does it require quite so much force, I guess you would say, tanks?
President Obama said we had a red line in Syria and nothing happened. Vladimir Putin said he had a red line in the Ukraine. The Ukrainians crossed it. to use a old school analysis which applies to nationalist policies, which is what this is about, the war between nationalism and globalism.
Hmm.
George Soros attempted to usurp a, like him or not, legally elected president of the Ukraine. And before anybody says, well, there were irregularities, Jimmy Carter was there, for God's sakes. If Jimmy Carter approves it, it must be good. That's all you can say about that. The truth is, if I'm going to sit there as the school bully and tell you I will beat you up if you don't give me your lunch money tomorrow, and you don't give me your lunch money tomorrow, and I don't beat you up, you're not much of a bully. But if I sit there and I beat the hell out of you, take your lunch money, and then I find another kid and say, you watched, you didn't give me your lunch money either, and beat the hell out of him, every other kid in that schoolhouse is going to be intimidated by you, i.e. Europe. So he's going to go in there, reunite the Armenians with the nation of Armenia inside of Georgia. He's going to protect them and offer them great deals. He's going to exploit the natural resources of Georgia and use that territory for the pipeline. And he's going to teach the Europeans a lesson. The difference this time, every world war that the United States has been involved in, and Great Britain, we were creditor nations. We're no longer creditor nations. We're debtor nations. How long can we sustain a massive, conventional, keyword, conventional war when we're bankrupt? We can't.
John, I think the answer is the banksters offered President Lincoln loans too, right? I think it was 35% interest.
Yes, but President Lincoln didn't have 30% of his raw materials and finished goods coming from an enemy nation, i.e. China.
I know. But let me go a little bit more into your article, because I think this is important. The current president in Georgia is actually, what shall we say, somewhat friendly with Russia. His business interests, he got rich from, and still has businesses in Russia, and is seen as being on the pro-Russia side. And so, did that enter into your calculations? Do you think that would change things? It doesn't matter. Russia's just going to do what Russia needs to do?
No, it entered into the calculations, and I figured the leader would act somewhat complicit with the Russians. The problem with Georgia is it's a sideshow meant to intimidate and humiliate the United States. The reason this is all very interesting timing is President Obama is on a plane to China, landing there probably as we speak. What will Obama's reaction be if Russia launched a two-front war in its own territory, from its own territory, seizing the eastern Ukraine, cutting Ukraine off from its port of Odessa, militarizing Transnistria in Moldova and western Ukraine, stocking up with more on the borders of NATO nations, and basically humiliating Obama in front of the Chinese leader? He has no options. So what's going to happen in Georgia is most of the military will succumb to this and just accept it as we were betrayed by the West. Those that resist will be crushed, just like the Ukrainians. Any Ukrainian Air Force base which launches resistance is going to be crushed. They will be under a hail of rocket and missile fire and bombs, and they will just wipe that entire base off the map. Any units which will resist will be slaughtered, and it will be an intimidation message for the Europeans. Name a European country which has a stomach for a fight right now. None of them. Poland's the only one that would fight, and Poland is outgunned. They can't do it, not by themselves. The United States can't do it. So it's a line in the sand that no one's. Well, it's more than that. But when you go back to the old NATO strategy, do you honestly think, in the defense of Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the bankers, that Poland or Germany is going to say, yeah, you can detonate tactical nukes on our territory to stop the Russians? Hell no. They'll cut deals with the Russians first. And
well,
that's
the
why
other thing is they don't want their gas cut off.
It's about to get cut off. Period.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, and I was also wondering, in the case of Poland, years ago, I was staying with friends in Germany. This was before the Second Gulf War, who were a military family, and the husband came home and sat everybody down, and there had been a big meeting on base. This is American base in Germany, saying essentially that most of the German bases were going to be shut down, and the U.S. was going to move everything to Poland, partly because it was cheaper, and also because they could build bases that would be smaller where people wouldn't bring families except for officers, and that except for Ramstein and a couple of really important things, Germany was going to be pretty much abandoned. Well, then the Second Gulf War happened and that didn't occur. But it looks to me, as soon as I heard that we were moving troops to Poland, it sounds like it's just the same strategy, only being employed later. And I just wonder, was this already in the works, or is this really in a response to Russia?
It was a response to Russia, and the grand total of troops being sent to Poland has been reduced from 600 to 150.
Oh, okay. So they're not actually doing that.
Well, it's even worse than you think. The quote-unquote frontline fighters we sent to them are 40 years old, modified over the decades. These are not the modern designs. We're not sending stealths over there. Currently, at this time, we're in a Cold War setting. We're back to the old peak of the 1970s, 1980s, when I remember it being at its worst. Apparently, I had a nuclear submarine off my coast and didn't even know it, along with a Russian tug operating in the spy net for the last month. We've had reports of increases of spy numbers activities from Cuba and Europe, primarily from European or Russian sources, on the shortwave. We've had increases of reports of bear sightings, which are the Tu-95, Tupolev-95 bombers, testing the Alaskan air defenses, and of course, as you're well aware, the UK and Netherlands, also Norway. It's becoming more of a situation where they're seeing what our resolve is, and we have no resolve.
Yeah, I was really interested to see that Sweden has started setting up missiles or something. I didn't totally understand it, but I've lived in Sweden, and it's a myth that most Americans have, that the Swedes will just like lay down their arms and not do anything. We knew people in the Swedish military who told us that they trained for three things. They trained for NATO missions, they trained for civil defense, and they trained in case of a Russian invasion. So
they've armed their fighter bombers with cruise missiles capable of delivering long-range strikes. It's standard practice. I do not think that Sweden is going to be involved in this fight, and I honestly don't think there'll be an invasion of NATO nations. Now, the intimidation factor on Latvia with the 2 helicopter squadrons being sent there, patrolling literally on the border from the Russians, is part of what's going on in other parts of the country. You don't hear about the deployments towards Georgia and South Ossetia, but there's been an armored brigade sent to that region also. Not big publicity, quote-unquote, for training purposes. Folks, they want to go into Georgia. It's not going to be the same as the Ukraine. There will be some resistance in the Ukraine, but I don't think we're going to see a massive tank battle or casualties. If there is one, the Russians will surround Kiev and starve them out and pound the living hell out of them. They will make an example of the Ukraine for the European Union.
So do you think they're actually going to try invading EU nations like like Lithuania and places like that, or do you think they'll stop?
And in fact, I haven't even finished the piece on this. I was doing an analysis of this all week, and it looks like events are overtaking my ability to sit there and do my research. But I think the Russians are going to put a large number of troops, including bases and fixed units, surface-to-surface missiles, bringing their intermediate-range ballistic missile fleet back into that area to intimidate Germany, France, Netherlands, Belgium, etc.
Hey, John.
Yes.
If I can interrupt here on something. So I go through a lot of Russian news sources, and in the last few weeks, the different Baltic states, like let's say for example, the mayor of Riga, the biggest city in Latvia, they've become very they've changed their tune. They've become a lot more understanding of the 20 or 30% of their citizens who are Russian and don't get passports and don't get whatever, the right to vote and stuff like that. This is interesting because some of them had been rather harsh towards Russians. So you get the feeling that they're getting very nervous. just in case you weren't aware of that, I'm just saying you can see it. They're just saying, hey, we better change what we've been doing here.
I am aware of that. Estonia, however, is still holding the line, firmly
Well,
demanding. They're
think
demanding NATO to sit there and become more involved and deploy more forces into
that's
the region.
true, but the big one is Latvia because they have such a high percentage. I think it's 30% Russian.
Yeah.
And it would be, but getting back to my earlier point in the Ukraine, it would be very easy for Russia to just create unrest, a color revolution. Just give everybody $50 a day, which is not bad money there, to protest, just like in Kiev, right? You just pay people, give them food, and block government buildings and so on, and scream, I can't get a passport, how can an EU country do this? You won't even do this to gypsies, and you do it to poor little Russians. And you know what I'm saying. And Christ, if you got 30% of the country that's Russian, pay them, and they can make the country economically collapse, block a major road, block the city.
But if you want to sit there and accelerate that process and drive a point home.
That's right. You're right. What you're arguing is that Russia should do these things like in Georgia with essentially force, because that will make everybody else sit up at the table.
Exactly. George Soros recognizes brute force economically. George Soros doesn't have an army to fight with. So when Soros sat there and financed the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, he was the primary financier behind this.
Right.
Mm-hmm. The backlash from the Russian circles was, well, beyond livid from what I understand. And reading the Russian media and reading the Russian language media, you could see why they were upset. And when the Ukrainian government collapsed, instead of sitting there and taking the Russian opinion or options into account, it's akin to Mexico being flipped over to North Korean control. By God, we would have a stroke in this country. We wouldn't tolerate it. Well, that's right on their border, in the heart of their country, where their pipelines transit through to the Europeans. This is a war of nationalism versus globalism, and I think the Russians and the Chinese aren't in the picture yet, but the Russians first, are going to demonstrate to the bankers of the West that we may not be what we were in 1982, but we are strong enough and brutal enough to teach you a lesson you will not forget. Once the Ukraine is surrounded, and that's why I said I don't think they're going to invade most of the western Ukraine. I think they're just going to take that slice off along the Black Sea, through Odessa, seize that territory, link it to Transnistria, intimidate Moldova, which will fall in short order. Belarus will vote to join the Federation before it's all said and done, probably before this summer is over, and put NATO back on its heels. Because the one thing that George Soros won't finance is a remilitarization program of the United States and NATO nations. He has no gain from this. He doesn't win from the United States entering into a defense spending race. And we can't afford to put 300,000 troops in Europe. We are literally bankrupt. And to put those forces there, if we were to say World War III, like some of the crazy people are talking, to put enough forces to stop the Russians will take us 3 months. The war will be over in 1.
Well, I think that's an issue for sure. I think that's a high-level thing. But I think our listeners might benefit from realizing what the issue is with the dollar. I mean, what Putin has been trying to do is not exactly to recreate the Soviet Union. As a Russian nationalist, the Soviet Union was a big disaster. What he wants to do is to create a Eurasian Union, an economic union. In other words, in the Soviet Union, a place like Kazakhstan or whatever, these places were huge economic drains.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, what he wants to do is to make, from Europe to China, one big profit center for everybody. And obviously, Russia being in the middle of that would profit immensely. And also, the big thing is the U.S. Navy control of the world would not matter very much. Right now, the U.S. Navy controls places like the Malacca Straits off of Singapore. So all this oil going to China or Japan is under U.S. Navy control, essentially. And so what he's trying to do is put all these heavy rail, freeways, pipelines, all kinds of things from Europe to China
And India.
and India and
That deals
develop
with
things.
drugs. So yeah, it's going to
Okay,
work.
and the point is, even though something was part of the Soviet Union, they couldn't develop it because they didn't have the roads, they didn't have the technology, and places like China and India and all were not rich enough to use things 30, 40 years ago. But that's totally changed now. And so Putin's desire to create this Eurasian Union is a tremendous threat to the dollar because they will not be using the dollar. There's no way that some deal in the middle of Asia that's like 1/3 investors are Russian, 1/3 Chinese, and 1/3 Indian or whatever. There's no way that they're going to need to use the dollar if the U.S. isn't even remotely involved. And so this is a threat to the dollar. This is a very, very serious threat. And so I see also the Ukraine as a huge attempt to drive Western Europe away from Russia.
You mean from the United States? It'll drive
In other words, Russia, their policy has been to make friends with Europe as best they can, and particularly with the conservative parties. A lot of them are actually not at all hostile to Russia. The EU is hostile, but a large part. I mean, you even see it. I mean, Le Pen, the National Front leader, keeps saying that Russia's position with the Crimea is totally rational. I mean, Russia is not the bad boy here; it's the U.S. that's the bad boy. And so I'm just trying to say Russia does have some friends in Western Europe, but from a U.S. point of view, blowing up the Ukraine will be very, very damaging for Russia's relations with Europe.
But there's one problem.
Mm-hmm.
What will Europe do without Russian energy? And that's the problem that Europe has. They did not want to acknowledge that they ignored Reagan's advice as president, which is amazing because he warned, do not become addicted to Russian petroleum. Do not submit yourself to the bear. No one listened. He's a crazy, senile old man. What the hell does that crazy actor know? Well, what happened? Pipelines were built to Europe. A dependency was developed. How many oil wells and natural gas fields? How much fracking is occurring in Germany? In France? In Belgium or the Netherlands? In Spain? None. Why? Because we got the Russians doing it. Let them dirty themselves and their nation with that dirty product, that polluting product. The biggest story that everyone's missing is the leader of Germany graduated from what college? Can anybody name it? It'll blow your mind when I tell you. Her graduate degree, postgraduate degree.
Wasn't it in Moscow?
The University of Moscow in the Soviet Union.
That
my
was
roommate's from Germany. She told me.
But her undergraduate was Mecklenburg. I don't know. But anyway, supposedly she knew Putin.
Berlin Polytechnic.
In Dresden. Anyway, Putin was in charge of a lot of KGB stuff in East Germany. And
well, so was her father.
Yeah. Her father, wasn't he like a Lutheran?
I'll read it to you. This is from Der Aufstieg. I wrote this piece back in 2011, ironically. Horst Kosner, the father of the chancellor, had significantly shaped his daughter. Only a few weeks after Merkel's birth, he moved with his family in 1954 voluntarily as a pastor of Hamburg in the GDR. As head of the College of Pastoral, a religious training center, the operative in East Germany as Red Kosner, which is what he was known as, known man of pastor's perspective, not only for the training, but also a very SED-compliant church politics. Mm-hmm. Working with former Stasi employees and influential officials in the East German CDU, he operated and created a split in the evangelical church. What happened was he would accept confessionals, and any confessionals that were in opposition to the East German or Soviet governments were reported to the Stasi.
Yeah, well, what can you say? He was a guy working with...
You could have a double agent sitting in Berlin right now. Angela Merkel is no saint. Angela Merkel, you don't go to the University of Moscow and be invited to join the Politburo unless you have achieved something great in your political economy studies in the Soviet Union. She is no special person. Everyone's ignored her past, just like everyone's ignored Obama's past. The problem we have with the chancellor is we hear the lip service about, oh, we're going to pass new sanctions and everything. The reality is the Germans cannot survive without cheap energy. The German economic machine is totally dependent on cheap energy and on Russia accepting the euro as payment. What happens when Russia says, we want payment for our gas in rubles? We want payment for our gas in yuan if you can't pay it in rubles. See, they already have an exchange arrangement with the Chinese to sell natural gas and oil in yuan and trade back and forth. They have the same arrangement with Iran. We'll send you parts for your atomic energy program. You send us gold. You start looking at the various arrangements throughout the world that Russia and China have set up. When they decide to sit there and retaliate economically against the dollar, they have the petroleum. We don't. The Keystone Pipeline's been voided. If you didn't get the news, Obama's not going to allow the program to go forward. He's canceled it. He will not accept it or approve it during his watch. We no longer have a program for cheap energy out of the United States to supply Europe. There's this Republican Party fantasy. Oh, well, we'll just build LNG plants and ship it all to Europe. 10 years to build the pipelines and plants, provided there's not one single lawsuit. Provided the Chinese supply us with 1,000 ships. It's not going to happen. So now you're looking at an entire continent. The European Union has to make a choice. Do we trust the Americans, who have betrayed every ally we've had in the last six years? Or do we simply remain neutral, keep our relations status quo with Russia, and accept the breakup of NATO as a viable military union? I think the latter is what Russia is truly shooting for. They wish to sit there and shatter NATO.
Of course, this is their goal, is to get the U.S. out of Europe. This is their highest goal.
They're going to win.
That may well happen.
Yeah, I can say as somebody living over here that people are very worried, even in Ireland, about the natural gas thing, because even though we don't really have that much natural gas here, it affects things like the power plants and stuff. And there have been small articles in the paper already about concerns for this winter.
But from your perspective, does anybody in Ireland really want to fight for the Ukraine?
No.
Not here either.
I'm not surprised.
No surprise. Hey, John, I'll give you roughly a quote. There's one from Kissinger along the lines of, the only thing more dangerous than being a friend of America, than being an enemy of America is being a friend.
Absolutely. Ask the nation of Cyprus.
So, look, they say that countries only have interests. They don't really have friends, right? The U.S. is just trying to maintain the dollar. And if that could happen by, blowing up the Ukraine, then fine, blow it up. If that can happen by bribing somebody, you know what I mean? They just want to do what they want to do. The interesting thing to me, though, is the U.S. has been making enemies of both China and Russia at the same time. And that seems rather strange. I mean, shouldn't you want to use one against the other? Why do you think the U.S. is doing what it's doing against China?
It is a belief that there's this is another one of those great myths. If I owe you $100, I'm the one in trouble. If I owe you $1 million, you're the one in trouble. Well, there's this myth that the Chinese nation cannot survive because we owe them over $1.7 trillion. The problem with that theory is, but if the person you owe $1.7 trillion to is willing to launch 4 EMPs and send you back to 1870, you really better not screw with them. Well, Obama is so arrogant, along with the Federal Reserve and bankers in our country, they honestly believe that because we owe them $1.7 trillion that we can still dictate policy. And China has ceased cooperation on so many fronts. And the American people seem to think that everything is wonderful. Now, do you want to know how to bring the United States to its knees if you're China in 1 month?
Okay, how?
Let's say World War III erupts between Russia and the United States. China announces a total embargo of everything to the United States. Could you imagine the hissy fit of the iPhone 6 will not be available in 2014 due to the war and the embargo? This country would collapse and demand surrender immediately. We are a nation of wusses. We are a nation of comfort. We have no idea what hard times are. The Chinese could starve half their population and not give a crap. The United States, what do you mean I can't get McNuggets because of the embargo? This country would freak out.
But isn't that why, Homeland Security is buying all these armor-piercing bullets?
Well, it's why
it's for the homeland, isn't it? It's not for fighting China.
No, that's why they bought 25 million rounds of 12-gauge ammunition, and it's damned hard to find already. It's getting ridiculous.
That's what I'm saying. By the way, China has a couple of other cards that are pretty easy. One is they could just pay or allow piracy in the South China Sea to prevent ships from getting to Japan. And if Japan couldn't get oil, you'd be looking at a currency collapse or all kinds of things. China is a big, big country with a lot of options that people don't usually think about. And it's awfully hard to fight thousands of pirates.
Right? I've got news for you. They don't have to do that. If we end up in a shooting war with Russia, can I ask you a question that this is just a rhetorical question for everyone to consider? What do you think the reaction would be of the United States to seeing an aircraft carrier sunk in Norfolk Harbor? We don't have the ability to stop their submarines from doing that. The Russians could come over here, sink two of our aircraft carriers, one in port, one off the coast, and we wouldn't know how to react. The Chinese could sink two more over there in the South China or East China Sea. Now, what would happen to this country if we lost 15, 20,000 men because we lost aircraft carriers, which are dinosaurs anyways? Yeah, they're relics of our previous era. This country couldn't handle it. We would not know what to do. And the only option we have militarily is to threaten nuclear attack. We can't threaten that. That works in the Cold War. There is no mutually assured destruction. We would be the destroyed nation. Oh, China would be hurt. Russia would be hurt. But they'll rebound. This country would cease to exist. You could kill two-thirds of our population, and the United States of America would cease to exist as a functioning entity worldwide for 50 years. Maybe 100. We cannot recover because of the stupidity and arrogance of our political leadership. We have put ourselves in this box. We have to withdraw from the world stage, reassess, get our debts in order, come up with a currency that's viable instead of a promise of a currency, become economically self-dependent before we become economically interdependent. This interdependency that we created. If you look at what China could do to us with an embargo, you would see every Walmart close, every Kmart close, every department store close, our auto industry would shut down, our defense industry would shut down. We couldn't even get people to go. The railroads would shut down because what are they going to haul? Scrap from Florida to Seattle to sit in port and wait for a Chinese ship that may never show up? We have created an interdependent world where we thought globalism would stop all world war. We never thought, what happens if everybody decides the world war is aimed at us? We've never thought about that. It was never strategized. Now we're about to pay the price for it.
Well, I think come on, John, didn't you read the book? It was the end of history. Everything ended about 25 years ago, and from then on, the U.S. was going to be on top, and everyone was going to do what we wanted, and that's it. And democracy, free market capitalism, such as it is, and democracy would be dominant. And I remember when that book came out, Francis Fukuyama and all that, and I just thought, this book is like the defining moment of when things are going to start falling apart. Because when you can promote a book saying that, whatever, God has determined that you're on top and your system is best, when you can start seriously talking about that on the television, you're losing the plot.
And it's not the end of history anymore. It's the
Looks like history might be happening any day now.
it looks like history might be happening any hour now, based on the news flashes I'm getting right now. It's an amazing situation where most Americans are still living in the comfort of their iPhone. I call it the I-idiocy. Now, I'm not criticizing people who own iPhones. It just happens to be the modern cultural icon and representative of our society, the ultimate creature comfort. We've got a pad to sit there and play games and draw things and let our kids become educated on it. We've got an iPad. We've got an iPhone to talk to our friends, listen to music, and have social media out our wazoo. We have conveniences that we thought we would never see in our lifetime. Goods, whenever we want them, delivered to us, or we can go to the store, order them, and pick them up. No one ever asked where they came from. No one cared. As long as the price was right, we could sit there and exist as a nation. Consume, consume, consume. When the necessity of production revolves back into the historical perspective, when self-dependency rather than interdependency is highlighted, you do realize at that point in time, as the authors failed to do so in the end of history, which I read also, I thought it was a joke, that when a nation's currency and economic system collapses, there's no one to bail them out. The theory is, well, if Europe collapses, America will be there. If America collapses, Europe will be there. But if they both collapse, it's going to be a vulture picking over the bones.
Well, I got a question for you here, John. Okay. We can see, roughly speaking, what China and Russia are thinking here. Okay. But clearly they think the time is on their side, right? That the U.S. control will be weaker 10 years from now if there's no big war, right? So in other words, they haven't really been pushing this to come into a head. And it looks more like it's the U.S. that's been pushing it, like the putsch in Kiev and, ratcheting up sanctions and all this other kind of stuff. Do you agree with that? Do you think it's really been more that the U.S. is frenetic and that Russia and China are more willing to wait because they feel that time is on their side?
I call it desperation relevancy, like you stated, I stated a little bit more bluntly, I think. We're desperate to remain relevant and in control of world events. And because we have surrendered that control worldwide, we're desperate to sit there and influence world events where we have no business or capabilities to do so. The new sanctions, which will be announced on Monday, will probably be tantamount to a declaration of economic war, which actually occurred about 14 days ago when the United States declared the war on gold. I know that sounds insane. I haven't written the story
Tell
yet.
me more. When did this war happen? I'm out of the States, so I'm not totally up on it, but who's winning? Is gold in the lead, or is the U.S. government in the lead?
Well, it's a war on gold by telling our central banks to push the price of gold down to hurt Russia and to hurt China.
Russia and China, I'm sure China's hurting. They're just saying, give us more.
Well,
get an extra 1,000 tons.
They want to sit there, and they think that putting a paper loss into the game will actually hurt Russia and China, whereas they're developing the capabilities to use gold and other commodities, including petroleum products, silver, platinum, whatever, as a backing for a currency and to refute the United States dollar. This is where I see the collapse of the dollar now evolving. When I wrote that piece originally, it was based the day the dollar died. That novel was based on the concept of a debt-centric or debt-based collapse. And I wrote it for that time period. Now we're in a debt-based collapse, but a double-edged sword is a geopolitical edge that was not anticipated, the revival of nationalism. I never realized how rapidly Putin has redeveloped his military, redeveloped his industrial capacity, and focused his foreign policy away from NATO and the West, only paying it lip service and disrespect since about 06-07, and focusing instead on South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and of course China.
He's a Eurasianist.
Oh, absolutely. He's a big-time believer in Eurasian preeminence in the world. And realistically, that is a fair thing to believe because they have the resources. They don't need us.
Well, they have the population and they're industrializing. I mean, um,
Name
love them or
something
hate them,
name
Iran
something
has
we have they
modern.
need.
Yeah,
What do we?
exactly. Exactly. By the way, let's see a couple of things. One is, have you heard about the altine? There's a Turkish word for gold, but a number of the SCO countries, like Russia and China, have essentially said they do want a gold settlement currency system. Uh, within I think it was 10 years, and so they're calling it the altine because the idea is the Silk Road. The Silk Road was largely a Turkish thing, a Turkic, like all the tribes in Central Asia.
Right.
And so they're using the word that had been used, 2,000 years ago or whatever it was, 1,300 years ago in the Silk Road. And so that's an interesting phenomenon right there. But did you, by the way, John, did you see the video that the Spetsnaz types released of their takeover in the Crimea?
I saw numerous videos.
Well, they released one
Takeover.
of themselves. This is their highlights. It's like their best excerpts that they videotaped themselves on their cell phones or whatever. And I don't know, it was maybe 20 minutes or so. But you watch that, and that was a tremendously impressive performance. That they could take over a place with more than 2 million people, which had lots of Ukrainian soldiers and lots of these Ukrainian radical nationalists all over the place. And to do that with hardly firing a shot, I mean, hardly killing anybody, was, I think, a sign of how effective they've, whatever you want to call it, modernized their military.
Well, boy, I tell you, there's so much I could say about that because what they've done with their military is astonishing. Whether it's the new grenade launcher, the updated armor to their tanks, and reactive armor, their new body armor, which is basically taking the primary United States round, the 5.56 NATO. Their new body armor is impervious to our rounds, our primary bullet. It's one of those situations where the Spetsnaz were demonstrating and showing off, not just to sit there and let the Europeans know, but to send a message to the U.S. military that we're not Iraq, we're not Afghanistan, we're not Uganda, we're not Libya. Don't try that here. And when you look at what we've done to our military with 8, 9, 10, 12, 14 rotations in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan, they're too tired to fight. So they sent a message. We received it. Experienced generals and combat personnel are like saying, don't try it. Don't try it. We can't help. We can't stop them. Now, if Obama wants to commit national suicide and send our military to fight the Russians, it's suicide. It's a suicide run. They would have had to start the draft, start building factories 6 months ago, start developing planes that actually work. There's an article tonight about how the Boeing F-35 isn't that stealthy. Oh, great. There's $350 billion down the toilet. We are looking at a situation now where we cannot fight in a conventional conflict for more than a month. The Chinese know it. The Russians know it. So if you can't fight in a conventional conflict, we're going to try the economic conflict. Well, we're so arrogant, we think we can win on that front also. Why do you think Putin is so cheery and bouncing around saying, boy, if the Americans would just do something about that radical government in Kiev? Well, the Russians know they have the final card. And if the United States persuades the Europeans to impose sanctions that actually have a little bite to it, the gas gets turned off. Energy prices go through the ceiling. And the United States will end up paying the price for it. We can't afford another $2 trillion collapse in our financial markets. It would destroy this country. So thus those 12-gauge rounds in the Department of Homeland Security, yeah, they'll probably get some use this time. When Grandma and Grandpa can't get their money and the banks are closed, we're going to have a major problem in this country. The Russians know that. The Chinese know that. And the Chinese could help trigger it on their own. No one knows how to deal with the situation when a global war erupts and no shooting occurs. If the Russians put all their troops on NATO's borders and forced us into a spending spiral that just kills us financially and militarily, and then the Chinese invade the Senkaku Islands and finish their occupation of the Philippine Spratlys, which they've already started, by the way. Small subnote, but it's got the Philippines rather upset. And they begin militarizing East Asia and the areas around Japan and the Philippines. What are we going to do about it? If we go into a direct conflict and actually say we're going to support them, we're asking for war.
Well, John, I think the question is, the U.S. probably needs to make some choices, hard choices, and that is, do you want to put your forces in Asia or do you want them in Europe? Choose one, that kind of thing. And if you put them in both, they just might be too weak in both places. They might end up being sitting ducks. Or if not sitting ducks as in dead ducks, they'd be sitting there and they wouldn't have enough to actually do what they needed to do. So you got to ask yourself whether the U.S. doesn't need to basically retrench. I mean, just supplying people in Afghanistan seems crazy. The Russians can cut off the supply lines at will.
They already have.
Have they? Yeah, that's
Yes.
what some people are saying.
No, they've already told the United States that all leases for rail and air transport via Russian republics has been cut off. They did that a couple months ago, before this crisis erupted.
Well, but they knew when you say that, the crisis in Kiev was already going on. They knew what we were up to. They might not have been sure about the sniper fire and all that kind of stuff, but they knew that we were going to take down the government there. It was just a question of how we went about it. So it was obvious, I mean, back in the Olympics, right? It was pretty darn clear that we were playing hardball with the Russians.
Oh, and the Russians had a plan in place already for this before the Olympics. They knew that they could take advantage of American weakness. The problem is that we don't know how to deal with the problem with the military aspects of this is really quite simple. We don't have enough troops to go to both locations. We've already put 60,000 troops in Southeast Asia and in Australia. So now what are we going to do? We're going to pack them all up and move them back to Europe? Can't do it.
Hey, John, I got a question for you. Okay, I was listening to somebody who's quite knowledgeable about Eastern European affairs, and he said it's widely reported, and you can't verify it for a fact, but it's widely reported that Putin every morning does an hour of meditation and followed by an hour of judo. And do you think that Obama gets up in the morning and meditates and then does judo?
I think that his meditation consists of watching a rerun of Oprah.
Okay.
And then maybe shooting some hoops, smoking a cigarette or two, and
well, no, I'm not trying to pick on him. Good for doing the basketball or whatever. I'm just trying to say that
it's not the same intensity. No, there's not the same dedication to his country. Trust me.
I think that Putin has a seriousness of purpose, and that can make you nervous if you're from Estonia for sure. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. But I do think that we need to think long and hard. And as I said, I just think we're overextended. We can't. I mean, Afghanistan, Philippines. I mean, the whole world. The U.S. says is a vital interest. And who was that? I think it was it Bismarck who said something like, it was Frederick the Great. To defend everything is to defend nothing.
Correct.
And that's just kind of the way I'm feeling about it. I mean, if you want to put troops in this country, that country, that country, every other country, sure. But I mean, Russia only has to attack in 5 places or whatever, 7 places. And the U.S. is saying we're going to defend 57, right? I mean, that kind of leaves you spread awfully thin, your supply lines in particular. But anyway, so we're
let me hold on a second here. Let me say, you made a very interesting statement. And the Chinese and Russian joint strategy in the first 72 hours of a conflict with the United States is to sink every aircraft carrier. Now, they'll probably get 4 out of 5 active carriers in the first 48 hours. We have no defense against that. We claim we do. But once we lose our aircraft carriers, our forward projection capabilities are so greatly reduced that we are basically a sitting duck in our own country.
Hey, John, there's a quote from Admiral Rickover, who's like the father of the nuclear navy, right? That there are 2 kinds of vessels in the ocean, submarines and targets.
Bingo. And that's what I was going to go to. Rickover warned everyone with the evolution of nuclear submarines, and despite the dismissal by modern American naval thinking that electric diesel was an extinct technology, by God, we watched one of them allegedly cruise off the coast of Los Angeles at rush hour 2 years ago, and fire an intermediate range ballistic missile off the coast of LA. And of course, it was denied. But anybody who is an seasoned observer with a brain in the military said, oh, that's a submarine launched missile. Now, you tell me how secure you feel in the United States of America knowing that a Chinese submarine, which was shadowing the USS Ronald Reagan on its initial voyage, broke off that contact when the Reagan went to save a cruise ship, cruised off the coast of LA and fired a missile off to tell our administration, we own you, not the other way around.
Yeah, that definitely stood out as being like, what went on there? That raised a lot of questions. But the aircraft carriers are obsolete anyway, right? They're just for delivering stuff. In other words, it's better to have Diego Garcia than an aircraft carrier, right? It's just the aircraft carrier gets you closer and that kind of thing. But they're easily sunk with today's missiles. I mean, you can look on YouTube and see videos of countries testing their missiles. They're just amazingly good today.
Yeah. I mean, look, Diego Garcia is a sitting duck. What would happen if Diego Garcia came under assault from 2 Russian submarines launching submarine-launched cruise missiles?
Well, there'd be no Diego Garcia.
Correct. And I mean, without nukes, just hit the aviation fuel dump and ammunition dumps there. Okay, you've got a rock with a runway. Great. Now,
yeah, exactly.
It's an aircraft carrier which can't evade enemy activity. Fixed bases, fixed locations are extinct. And once we pick a fight with our enemies, we'll learn that the hard way. All these bases we have in Europe that we abandoned, probably a wise idea. The problem is we said we would guarantee their security, but never militarily or physically offered a way to do so. And economically, in their time of need, we turned our back. Hungary is bankrupt. Poland is the only East European country to emerge from the breakup of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc and succeed.
That's true. Well, there's another thing, though, about this, and that is survival. I was listening. There's a Swiss preparedness survival guy named Piero San Giorgio that I'm following, I'm interested in. And he actually thought a lot of Eastern Europe would survive an economic collapse quite well. They have the social cohesiveness. People still know how to garden. They don't have massive immigration, so you don't have quite the cultural issues that you might in Paris or London or something like that. So, they can handle hard times, but they can't really handle the gas getting cut off is the thing. And that's why this whole fight with Russia seems a bit strange. I mean, Europe can't afford to do it. It's that simple. I mean, they just can't. Hey, John, we're running out of time. We know you've got to get going here. I thought I would wrap it up with one last little personal question for you. In your show, you have all these great sound effects. Where do you get those? Are you like a sound? Was your day job working in sound? How do you get them?
Many, 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 many years ago, in a galaxy far, far away, where these things were called vinyl and needles, I did a little bit of work. Well, it's something that us guys who worked as nighttime DJs had.
Oh, okay.
At radio stations, and
what's a DJ?
Nobody listened. But exactly. Back then, it would have been what's an MP3. Well, I could tell you what an 8-track and a track player is, but you learned how to obtain sounds. The internet is a cornucopia of sounds, and if you have a good sound recorder, you can go and obtain them. So I've always had this really sadistic, twisted point of view about reality. You have to be a little bit fatalistic. When you grow up as a child of the 80s, you sit there and your theory was get drunk, survive, go to the next concert, the nukes didn't fall, repeat. Okay, life is good. Now we're back to this full cycle. You might as well make fun of it. Find the best sound effects and just have a good time with your shows. The financial report, the Chiquita Banana update, I found that video on YouTube as a commercial from the 1950s. I don't think Chiquita Banana is going to claim it because they don't want the dancing banana. It's probably going to be either racist, bigoted, or something insensitive that offends somebody in the banana community. So they don't care. But the bottom line is you find these clever things from years past that everyone forgets about until they hear it. And they go, oh, wow, now I get that. I look at it as, let's have a good time. Let's have a cigar, a glass of scotch, and watch the world burn. Why not?
You know what I'm thinking of is Dr. Strangelove. Let's break out the scotch, the cigar. Hey,
one of my favorite movies of all time. Good analysis.
Okay, John.
That's my closing theme song from that movie.
Yes, of course. We'll meet again. So anyway, thanks so much for coming, John. Do appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And check out my latest writings at johngaltfla.com. I will have full war coverage, which probably will be ongoing for quite a while. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's it, folks. It's a wrap. Thanks, John.
Bye, John.
Thanks, Disaster Cats.
Y'all have a good one.
Bye,
Thank you very much, guys. Take care.